Hello everyone, today my guest is composer Stefan Gregory. Stefan actually first started his career as a member of the Australian indie rock band Faker, before eventually moving to writing music for theater and opera and ballet, and then making his big screen debut with Netflix's new film, The Dig. It's a really lovely score that he's done. It's quite calming, relaxing, and a very good separate listening experience. But obviously it also works quite well in the film itself. And I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly interested in the film when I first read about it. It's about the excavation at Sutton Hoo in 1939, an old Saxon burial mound in the east of England. But it's a really engrossing film, in large part because of Stefan's score. But of course we don't only talk about the film, we talk about his journey, his approach to film music, and Stefan gives quite a good history lesson about opera, its growth and development, and what parallels that might have with the growth and development of film and film music as well. Now, we are nearing the end of the first season of the Film Scorer podcast. Be on the air for maybe another month and a half with new interviews and then taking a break, but you'll hear more news on that as it gets closer. As always, you can find more information about me on my website, thefilmscorer.com, or on social media at thefilmscorer, and you can find more information about Stefan on his website as well. Now, have a watch of the film, and then sit back and take a listen to this. So, Stefan, I'm so glad you're able to join me today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
Good. So, your first feature film, The Dig, just released on Netflix, which we're going to get to in a second, but you've actually had a really interesting journey into becoming a film composer. First being in the Aussie rock band Faker, composing for theater and ballet for a while, and then moving into film. So can you tell me a little bit about that journey and how you went from an indie rock background to where you are today?
Yeah, I don't really know how I ended up here. I mean, I actually did a degree in maths at university, and I worked in that area for a long time, and I still love that world actually. But I guess I was always hanging out with the artsy weirdo crowd at university, and from that I sort of found my way eventually into writing a lot of music and doing sound for theater productions. Before that, yeah, I did play in the rock band and was in the jazz world, but I guess I kept those contacts and eventually found myself doing theater work, which I still do, and I still make my money doing that stuff, and I just love it. And I guess it's just an opportunity for a composer these days. If you want to write music and you want to be paid for it, there's only certain avenues you can take, and that one just worked well for me for whatever reason.
Have you noticed a big difference between composing for film and composing for theater and ballet? Because I think for most people, for me at least, I've seen a few ballets and a few theater productions, but
Yeah,
particularly theater, I don't think a lot of people necessarily think about what sort of music or sound design, because I know you do that as well.
yeah.
What's involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, 90% of it is the same, right? Like it's the same essential job writing for theater and writing for film. You are trying to help tell a story with the music, and the music is subservient to the greater good of the project as well. You can't get too carried away with your own egotistical ideas because no one's going to like that. Actually, you have to do what works for the piece, and so that's all the same. But when it comes down to the sort of nitty gritty detail of it, I found some interesting differences. It's almost like when you get down to the detail of it, it's the opposite of theater or something. And it's to do with truth and the way that you interpret film as opposed to the way you interpret theater. In theater, you always know that it's fake. And the music you write for theater has to be more ironic is not quite the right word, but there has to be a sort of idea behind it or a cleverness or a different take. Whereas in film music, the music you write has to really be so true to the film. It has to really be absolutely a part of it. It has to be part of the sound. And so the music that I would write for film, if I put that in a theater show, most of the time it would just be cheesy and it wouldn't work. You'd be seen to try to put film on stage, or you'd be seen to try to put TV on stage or something, as it would come across. But in film, because all the elements are integrated, you hear a sound of a footstep and you see a foot falling, and even though it's all fake, we believe it is absolutely true. And so the music has to be true in a slightly different way. So although the 90% of the job is the same, there's this interesting thing that happens in the detail, which is different.
It is very interesting, and it's funny because in the lead up to this, I was almost thinking the opposite. That in some
Right.
ways, watching a theater production, it's as if the story and the characters, like that's truth, that's this realism, and yet it makes a lot of sense because in so many ways, no matter what the film is, whether it's a period piece like The Dig, something contemporary, or something set 500 years in the future in a different galaxy, like it's trying to immerse you and eventually switch your brain off into thinking, no, this is actually just happening in front of me.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are many ways to describe it. I mean, that's just how I describe it. You could probably describe it the opposite to that and still be true or something. But this is me trying to kind of latch onto something I've discovered. But yeah, you do believe it's true, even if it's a film set in the prehistoric times. You believe that the cameras were actually there thousands of years ago. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the problems with especially watching things at home and how easy it is to be distracted by everything around you or your phone because once there's anything external, it breaks that immersion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's true.
So The Dig tells the story of the excavation of Sutton Hoo in East Anglia in the UK in the eve of World War II. Being from Australia, I thought that that was a very kind of surprising choice for you as a composer. How did you get brought into this project?
I mean, it wasn't my choice to do that film. It wasn't like I had 1,000 films that were being offered to me, and I chose this one. Don't get me wrong; it's a topic which I really enjoyed writing for, and particularly writing about the landscape and the unusual topic of archaeology. But it's more than that. I mean, it's about the connection of humanity to land and to time and to our place in history and the sort of but I mean, how I got involved in this film is really just through the director, Simon Stone. I've been working with him for a long time on theatre productions, and this was his second feature film, and he asked me to work on it, and I was very happy to be involved.
Very cool. And I wasn't sure because I knew that Simon had done theater work, but as far as I know, there isn't like an IMDb of theater, so I could check, cross check all of your productions. That's really interesting. I mean, and that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, it was a fantastic opportunity. It's funny how there's not as much crossover between theatre and film. And you're right, there is no IMDb of theatre productions, so people often don't know much about that world. But yeah, we've been working for a long time in theatre.
Yeah, and I actually do think it's a shame because I've heard a few pieces written just for theater. PJ Harvey did one maybe 2 years ago that I haven't seen the production, but I mean the music was great, and so it would be so nice to have more exposure to a broader audience because obviously just like in film your first goal is for writing for theater is to boost the production itself, but in some ways not that it's a waste, but it's too bad that it doesn't get to live on in certain circumstances.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that. It's one of the things I've really enjoyed about working on film is that there's this permanent artifact left over. People are going to be able to watch this film for as long as the technology to play it exists. Whereas all the theatre productions I work on are gone to time. You know, they might be remounted or to a. I mean, it's the beauty of theatre is that it is ephemeral and that it disappears and that it can be different from night to night. I mean, that's absolutely its strength as well. But after having done that for so many years now, it is nice to finally have something that I can hold on to and show people and say, yeah, look, see, I really do, really do have work that I've made because, yeah, there isn't much of a record of a lot of those theatre productions.
Yeah, and then if you watch a recorded theater production or recorded ballet, it's just not the same.
It's really different. I mean, it's great for those of us who work in the industry and we can see a show that we haven't seen, but it's just not the same experience. And you can't really judge a show from that experience. Although some of these efforts that like the National Theatre are doing, these streaming live productions, and a group called ITA, which used to be Toneel Group Amsterdam, who I've done work for, they've, in the COVID era, they've started streaming some of their productions in very interesting ways. And I think that's quite effective, actually. There's something there. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. But declaring the cameras a lot more, and it still being a live show that you're seeing, but you're seeing all the camera work happening live, which is really interesting, actually. Seeing a live film be made, really, yeah.
Will this be the first time that something that you've written for a medium like this is actually going to be released? I guess I don't know. Are there plans for your score for the Dig to come out separately?
At the moment, I'm not sure. At the moment, they're saying they're not going to release it. It's sort of in Netflix's hands, actually, which surprised me because I didn't think it would be a big deal. There's been a lot of interest from labels actually in releasing it as well, and from people writing to me. And I thought if that happens, I'd be very lucky. And I thought, oh, we'll just release it. But actually, it turns out that's not the case. It's sort of in Netflix's hands, and for them, it's not really their thing, the music. So they're less interested in it. So I'm campaigning. I'm working on it. I still hope that it will come out, but yeah.
I hope so too. Getting the separate digital copies of it. It works well in film, obviously, but it's also, I mean, frankly, it's a really pleasant listen on its own. There are times where it's vaguely reminiscent of some of the styles of like Philip Glass or Max Richter, where it creates this immersive atmosphere that you can almost fall in and get lost into. I mean, it's something that is really nice to listen to separately. So keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, and it's not always that way with film scores. I think I read on your website, actually, you said it's really important to watch the film and not just listen to the score. Because it's true, like the music you write for a film, it's for the film. And it's not to say you can't listen to it outside, because it can often be really great to do that. But if it does work out of the context of the film, it's sort of like a lucky side effect.
Exactly.
And it shouldn't have to be that way. Because
ultimately, that's its purpose. And sometimes you can listen to a score on its own and it just sounds like droning tones. And you go, well, this is terrible to listen to. But it wasn't composed for you to listen to it on its own.
No.
It was supposed to support a film. And if it does that, then that's great. And everything else, like you said, that's just gravy.
Yeah, that is right. I mean, some of us like listening to strange droning tones as well. I do sometimes, but yeah.
I do too. Before I got interested in film music, I listened to a lot of metal and experimental music. So
okay.
I have a slightly different musical interest background than a lot of other people who are into film music.
Right. Okay, interesting. Yeah, one of my first theatre scores was a sort of ambient drone metal score, you could say. It involved playing live electric guitar to a sort of 6 or 7 hour work, or actually it was only 2 hours of that work, of The War of the Roses, which is sort of a landmark production here in Sydney.
See, that just makes it even worse, the ephemeral nature of theater, because like I would love to listen to that, like 2 hours of just drony metallic noises and electric guitar.
And Shakespeare on top.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was wondering is the Dig kind of operates an interesting time. And you mentioned this. One of the themes throughout it is kind of the continuity of time and how both us in our present can look back in time at the physical artifacts that exist and find out where we came from, but also those will continue to exist and what we leave behind will continue to exist. And so the film takes place in 1939, but it also obviously has a strong connection to the 6th century, which obviously leads to a lot of possible ways to go with the music. So how did you end up landing on the sound palette that you chose?
I don't know quite how we ended up here, but that is certainly one of the more interesting philosophical aspects of the film. And I mean, you're right to talk about that. You know, the idea of the permanence of time in a way, you know, the sort of Buddhist Nietzschean idea of eternal return, that everything that's happened is permanent and that it will keep happening forever or something. And it's sort of a strangely uplifting idea for me. It gives you sort of hope in the godless age we live in, or something, that there's, I don't know. But how do we end up at the sound palette? I mean, we started in a very different place in some ways. Simon had a very strong idea to use music of the period, like orchestral music of the period. And I thought that was a great starting point. I always suspected that concert hall music was never going to quite work for the film because films need film music, which functions in a different way. But I generated a lot of material in that world. But when it came to sort of putting it into the edit, I don't know, for whatever reason, it didn't quite work. And it became clear that we really needed music to do certain things in the film, function in really particular ways. And so I wrote music to really conquer certain tasks, I guess, in the film. And writing the music to evoke the landscape and that sort of stuff was a great pleasure, and it was sort of easy. Funnily enough, it's easy to write music, which for me that was inspired by that. But communicating the subtler philosophical aspects of the film, which is what you were asking about, was one of the more difficult parts because it's not a straight ahead sort of James Bond plot or something. That the plot twists in the film are subtle, and so it took a while of watching it and working with it to find out what the important moments were and the tone that they needed. And this philosophical idea that you've focused in on is one of the most important parts of it. And so there's some music which sort of scores that and reoccurs through the film. And in a way, that philosophical idea did inspire the music to the film, actually, or the more subtle music to the film, yeah.
So, I mean, how were you able to channel the philosophic nature and kind of the cyclical nature of everything into the music itself? I mean, and frankly, I realize how abstract we're getting at this point.
I don't know, actually. I mean, I don't even know if I do that successfully, but at a simple level, there's some really intimate piano music in the film, and that's appropriate for the moments where there's these intimate interactions between two people, like Basil and Mrs. Pretty, and it's reflective and it's very personal and it's lonely and meditative. And you could imagine the feeling that someone is having at the piano maybe while they're playing that music, and that helps communicate that idea to the audience, hopefully. But then there's two other modes in the film too. There's this chamber strings, and then there's the bigger orchestral moments, and they're really function in a very different way. I mean, there's a big orchestral piece of music when the ship is discovered, and that is getting at the same philosophical idea in a way, this sort of connection to time and to history, but it's selling it in a much bigger way. It's like the grand, it's like, how fantastic is that? Is this idea that humanity is connected to its past and that we're all connected to the earth and we're all going to die, and that history will repeat itself. And so it's sort of about the big emotions that idea can elicit, whereas the piano stuff is about the more personal, reflective moments that idea can elicit. And there's other moods in the film as well, but that's just some of it.
That makes sense. And I think some of the swells and those real emotional climaxes, and to anyone who hasn't watched it, and when I was reading about it beforehand, it seems weird to think of really having a strong emotional response to what on paper reads like a film about excavating an old ship, basically. It sounds so well. It doesn't sound necessarily like a particularly fascinating or emotional story, and yet it really is. And the one that resonated most with me is when they're really digging into the ship and they start finding the actual smaller pieces of artifacts, the jewels and items, and I think it's a belt, and it really hammers in like how much history that nobody ever knew about is right here. And at the same time, the music starts swelling too, and I was like, I did not expect to be impacted like this, particularly when it's in some ways the history of a country that is different from my own.
Yeah. I mean, it's a film about digging up treasure, and that's exciting. Everyone understands why that's exciting, I think. But it's interesting that you point out that moment in the film, because that was a really important moment for me in terms of discovering how to score the film, working out just how much excitement I needed to give the audience there. I needed to sell that moment with music, to say this is really exciting and profound. And I had to sort of consciously do that, I guess, to write that part of it, because when you're watching it, it's not obvious that it requires that level of excitement in the music. I mean, it's obvious now in retrospect when you're looking at it.
But yeah, and it works. It really just kind of sweeps you up into the moment. Like I said, I was kind of taken aback by it.
I mean, it is an amazing moment to happen, in a story and in history. So
my wife's from the UK. She's actually from a town about 75 miles west of Sutton Hoo. So
Oh, right.
it was interesting watching it with her because she had gone to the site when she was a kid and she was just really excited about it. And so having someone who has that stronger connection there with me, I think amplified everything as well.
Ah, that's interesting. Actually, there is an Australian connection to that area of Suffolk in that the Suffolk accent apparently is quite similar to the Australian accent. I think there was a large number of people in the convict times who came from that area to Australia, and there's a lot of convict songs, Australian songs, which come from the folk songs of that area in Suffolk. So, yeah, that's an interesting connection between Australia and that area.
That actually is, and it's one that's obviously not obvious at all.
Yeah, I guess my ancestors, probably some of them came on ships from that area to these distant shores. So
And it's funny you mention that because you can say the same thing about the U.S. as well, where
yeah,
going back towards its founding, it's the same thing, and I think that kind of goes in some ways towards the philosophical aspects we've been discussing too, where history and lineage is also it's not a straight line either. So there is a lot of that shared history as well, and it's just quite interesting to think about.
yeah, it is. And we tend to oversimplify these stories, talking about the history of tribes and things, because of course the reality is so much more complicated. The interminglings of peoples, and I was reading a bit about it in sort of preparing for the film and just to get interested in it. And yeah, there's a lot of controversy and a lot of different ideas, and a lot of the myths we think about the Gaelic people and the Anglo-Saxon people in England are apparently not true, and it's all much more complicated than you realize.
I'm not surprised, and so I had read that you ran into a few kind of exceptional circumstances while you were writing and recording the score.
Well, yeah, I mean, the same circumstances that a lot of people in the world were facing in many ways. Yeah, it was tough because post production really corresponded with the start of the pandemic in the UK. And we were living over in London at the time, working on the film. I had my mum staying with us to look after my 3-year-old daughter. We were both sort of working, me and my partner. But when the virus came, it was very difficult. She was 70, so we had to send her back home. And then my partner was pregnant, and we are not UK residents as such. And so we just decided at that time we would make the leap back to Australia, and we got on one of the last flights back before it got very difficult to get back. Because we didn't have a house back here when we arrived, we had to stay in a remote property outside of Sydney without hot water or phone coverage or the internet. So trying to finish my first feature film score in a place like that was challenging, but also very inspiring because it's a place really surrounded by landscape, and it has a big river going through it. And in a lot of ways, I guess it's a very different landscape to Suffolk, but it's a landscape nonetheless, and that earth is still connected to the same earth. And so it was an inspiring place to be writing, but it was difficult technically because I'd have to make these tracks and upload them to the director, who was at that time in Vienna. So I'd have to drive up the track in a 4-wheel drive and upload these QuickTime videos to him over a 4G connection on my phone, and then he'd get back to me about them. And it was a strange process. It was difficult. And then when it came to recording the score, of course, none of the orchestras were open for business, and we were looking at everywhere in the world to record it. And the first place it opened up was Iceland, thank goodness. And there's a really fantastic studio there on the outs, about 3 hours out of Reykjavik, and a little orchestra called Symphonia Nord. And we recorded there with very highly spaced players that were a long way apart, and managed to record the strings in 2 different takes, the high and the low strings, because we had limits on how many we could record at once. I think we were one of the first productions to be doing that at the time. That Iceland had only just opened up, so we were at the forefront of that sort of experimentation of recording during COVID. And a funny side effect of it was actually that the strings, despite the fact there was only 20 per high and low, so 40 altogether or so, but it actually sounds bigger than that, I think, in some of the recordings because of the spacing in the room. So nice little discovery was that you can get a bigger sound from less people if you space them in the room. Recording the winds was a real challenge because no one wanted to do that. It's you can't really ask wind players to be in the same room with each other, although now I think we're finding ways of doing that. But at the time, that wasn't really an option. And so all the wind players were recorded in London in their own bedrooms, basically, in home studios. So the whole thing was compiled together through these separate recordings, which is really a challenge because normally you record it all at once. You just have some microphones in the room. It's really easy to put together, but it was a real challenge from my music production team to put that together and just to record it and to make it happen really at all. Yeah, and I was listening in from Australia overnight, because it was Iceland time. So 7 p.m. I would sort of tune into the start of the session, and then I'd go till 9 a.m. and I'd be very tired by the end of it, and trying to give notes over Zoom on those sessions, when it's 4 a.m. and you can't see who you're talking to. It's very surreal, very surreal.
I mean, it seems so wild, and no matter how many times I hear stories of people trying to record and compose during that time in particular, it never seems any more normal. So many things have been normalized, and yet that experience still seems just so unreal.
Challenging, yeah.
Yes.
It was surreal. I mean, it was amazing to have all these people, because no one was traveling at the time. There was people on those sessions from Iceland who were tuning in. I had one producer in New York, someone else in Quito in South America, people in London, someone in Vienna listening in, me in Australia. It was that sort of a surreal experience to have these people from different time zones all around the world in those locations, like connecting those places, all listening into this session. And that was sort of amazing just in and to itself. So
yeah, I could imagine.
Now we've been back in Australia. I've been mostly working on some Australian projects here. And so I've been able to do recordings here in Australia. But yeah, and to be honest, because a lot of the work I do is in theatre, the theatre shows that I was going to do at the beginning of this year in Europe, I've had to pull out of because as Australians, we can't travel at the moment and it's very difficult to get back into the country. So I don't know. I have found ways, unfortunately, to overcome these obstacles, except that I guess I'm lucky enough in Australia at the moment that a lot of we're quite opened up. And so it's possible to record and work here at the moment. So we're very fortunate.
I see. So are most of your projects coming up then in some shape or form theater or ballet related?
Most of them. I mean, I hope to be doing more film, and there's certainly been some interest in that now that the film has come out. But in the immediate future, yeah, I'm working on an opera actually that I'm writing for Queensland Opera here. And right now I'm working on a theatre production for a theatre in Sydney called Belvoir Street Theatre.
Frankly, I'm not surprised that there's more interest in you composing for film. With you sort of almost jumping to the deep end like that on your first feature, did it feel like there was extra pressure on it?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, I felt pressure from myself to make it good because I really wanted to do this and I really wanted to do it well. But in some ways, I mean, I've worked with Simon so much, it just felt like another project in that sense. That felt very familiar. What was unfamiliar was some of the processes, I guess, just understanding post-production and how timelines work and what has to be done at a certain time. But in many ways, it's a lot more luxurious than working on theatre. There's a lot more money. There's a lot more people working for you. I was lucky enough to have a lot more time than I have normally in a theatre production. Sometimes I'll write all my music in a theatre production in 1 or 2 weeks because rehearsals start and you've got 5 or 6 weeks, but it takes a while before the piece finds itself. And so it's not really until a few weeks in that you can know what you're doing. So it felt a lot easier in a lot of ways. It felt finally I've got all this sort of support. I've got these people doing things for me, which in theatre I have to do all myself. So I think if there was pressure, it was probably from myself and in doing it. Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people speak to me about this film and they're like, well, where did you come from? How did you get this? How did you get this gig? What have you been doing? But I mean, I've been doing similar work, in theatre or whatever I've been doing for years. So it doesn't feel like that big a stretch in that way. It's just that it's permanent, and because it's streaming on Netflix, a lot more people have seen it than have seen my theatre work, which is great. But actually, I've been doing this for a long time, in a slightly different form. I think it's also a lot of people who work in film and do this stuff have solo careers. I don't have that. I don't have any albums out. So people talk to me and they're like, who are you? What do you do? So I think I need to make a solo album actually, so that people understand that I exist or something. So that's one of my projects this year.
That's serious that you'd actually want to do something like that.
Yeah, I want to do that. I've been thinking about it for ages. But it's about, you want to make a solo album. Well, what are you going to make? I mean, there's so many things you can do. I could make a pop album. I could make a neoclassical album. But I think I'm going to make a neoclassical kind of album of instrumental music.
So it's obviously that's in the works, but the very, very early stages. So we have no clue when we could expect it.
Yes, it's early stages. It's being written as we speak.
Oh, cool. I mean, that's very exciting. And we talked about it before, where that is one of the issues with writing for theater, ballet, and opera now as well, because it doesn't necessarily have that permanence. To say that it's as if you don't exist is over dramatic, obviously, but in some ways it's kind of like that, because they'll check Spotify and they'll check IMDb or Wikipedia, and if they don't see someone on those, then it's like, oh well, this person obviously just came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Like you said, having something that's a solo album gives you more permanence, and it's like, no, Stefan's right here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. But it makes you real all of a sudden. It's sort of what this film has done for me, actually, is it's made me real. People know that I exist now, which is nice. Or some people do.
It's exciting, and I don't know, I do think that in some ways it is a shame that the internet kind of makes things structured that way. So obviously, since you do have interest in composing for film going forward as well, is there a particular project that you would be most interested in working on, whether it be a style of music that you could write for film, or a style of film or genre itself?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's funny. I've been talking to agents recently, and they ask me this as well a bit. I mean, the truth is, in theatre, I work in so many different genres and forms. I mean, as you've heard, I did a show involving ambient, noisy, droning guitars, and this score for The Dig is very, very different to that. At the moment, I love writing dots on the page. I love writing music for classical musicians to perform. I get a lot of satisfaction of that. But I also like writing with electronics and sounds and guitars as well. Quite honestly, I would be interested in working in so many different genres. It's really more about the quality of the project and of what the story's about, if I think it's engaging for me. And my taste is quite wide. I think in reality, if I find more film work now, the next few jobs are probably going to be in a similar world to The Dig, because people understand that. And as I was just saying, I don't have a solo album. People need to understand what they're getting, especially when they're spending money on films. They cost a lot of money. It's expensive to hire a composer. Composers get fired from films all the time. They want some security in what they're getting. They're not necessarily going to trust me to write an avant-garde score straight away, even though I've done a lot of that in theatre, but they might not trust that. So I think probably my first few gigs are going to be in a similar vein to The Dig. But really, yeah, I just want to work with the directors and writers who I like and respect, and who make intelligent, interesting artistic work.
Makes a lot of sense, and I would find it hard to believe that hearing your work on The Dig, someone's going to come up to you and say, hey, I like that score. Do you want to work on this generic action film? Maybe you'd find that really interesting, but the connection doesn't seem there either.
No. I mean, I would love to do an action film one day, and maybe I can find a way to do that which is slightly different, but also embodies all the things that you need to do when you score an action film. There's a lot of particular things you need to do and marks you have to hit. But there seems to be interest these days in thinking outside the box with music and trying to find different solutions to it. So who knows what I'll get asked to do next. But the rules for different genres of film are different and require different ways of thinking about it, just in terms of where you put music and how it functions. But the nature of what that music is can actually be so many different things. Like there's so many ways to score a film or score a theatre show, particularly when it comes to genre or the instrumentation you choose. Like I could have scored The Dig with synthesizers. There could have been a contemporary score with it. There are many ways to score films. I don't think there's ever one solution that works. There are many interesting solutions to film scores, I think.
I think I've noticed that it seems like there's an increasing acceptance towards broader ways to approach scores as well. The actual sonic palettes are really almost anything you could think of can be a film score. I mean, like Johan Johansson in Mandy a few years ago was like a doom metal score, which wouldn't have existed in anything that anyone would have seen 10, 15 years ago. So it's really exciting. And I would imagine that for someone like you who has touched all sorts of genres as well, it's got to be exciting, because you can get into a project and do, or at least try out, whatever you want.
That is really exciting, actually. That's what excites me about working in film at the moment, is I feel like there is that experimentation that's starting to happen. There is a bit more focus on production, I think, with film scores at the moment. You have to be a bit of a producer in a way to sell your work. And to put your music to the film. It's about sound as much as it is about what you write. And there's a lot of people who argue that sort of harmonically and just purely musically that we've gone a bit banal with film scoring, in recent years. But I think that's changing a bit. And I mean, I love the classic era of film scoring. I love Bernard Herrmann and Franz Waxman and all those people. I love that stuff, and I miss aspects of that. But the wisdom in film scoring now is much deeper. It's really about a deep understanding of how film functions on a psychological level. And so sometimes all you do need is a tone, in a film, and just getting that tone right is exactly what gives you the atmosphere. And that's right. I always like to push the director or push the boundaries of what a director likes when I'm working on a project in an attempt to try to get the most interesting thing we can. So I like to start in a place which is a bit too radical for the project and then come back from there, which I did on The Dig as well. I think Simon and I both started in a more radical place for this and did some experiments which were a lot more radical and probably quite wrong for the film. And we came back to a place which is really quite expected in many ways. It's probably quite a predictable kind of film score in many ways, but it's important to start in a more radical place because it's always easy to end up in a more conventional place. But at least if you start in a more radical place, hopefully little bits of that radicalness still make it in. And there are little moments in The Dig, I hope, which are a bit unexpected still, possibly because of that starting place, I hope.
Yeah, I wouldn't call the end product radical necessarily.
No, certainly not.
But I think even saying that it's expected is downplaying it, because I listen to a lot of contemporary scores as they come out, and I mentioned this earlier, there are a few composers that you can say, oh, there are similarities in style or it's reminiscent, but at the same time,
Yeah.
it's also not something that stylistically and the way that it sounds is not something that you hear particularly often either. So even that, just in the palette itself, is enough to set it apart from, I'd say, the vast majority of what's coming out recently.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, I think even if you are doing a sort of known genre or a known sound, you've got to give it yourself. You've got to put yourself into it and make it your own version of that. Well, that's what I try to do. So, pretend that I am this style of composer and do it true to my heart, and then hopefully something comes out which is a little bit different at least and doesn't sound just like you're copying other people. And then you are that type of composer. If you can channel that properly.
And with the process, and not just the collaboration, but the amount of eyes that are on any production, especially the larger it is, sometimes, unfortunately, that's kind of what's expected, that there's a particular sound that maybe the director of the studio are looking for, and their expectation is that you will come in and you will ape that sound. And at the end of the day, your job is to be functional and be there, but it seems like that would be an unfortunate fate, especially for someone like you who really wants to put themselves and their own sound into a piece of film music.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that challenge of the director or the producers want a particular thing, and obviously if there's temp music on a film and you're being asked to go in that direction, and that can be difficult. But I think you just got to find your own way into that moment and just capitulate and say, okay, well, if what I'm doing is not working and I've got to go in this direction, what can I find in this temp music or whatever it is that they're offering me that I like, and what can I use to make my own sound from that? If you just try to replicate it too precisely without understanding how it's functioning and what it is about the temp music that they like, then you sort of fail, because I've made that mistake myself. But if you figure out what it is that they like about it, and you question the director, say, why is it that you keep harking back to this piece of music? What is it about it? Then you go, oh, okay, it's about this adjective, and you find that adjective in the music, and then you do your own version of that. I think that's the way to do it. But you do have to capitulate to the group, I guess, because it's a collaborative process. You can't just do what you want, because if it's not working for the director and the producers and the editor, then it's probably not going to work for the audience. So, they're your first feedback. So it's good to make them happy.
That makes sense, and I think that's a sensible compromise, I guess. What a lot of people, especially film music listeners, think of when they hear temp music. It's just replicating the sound and not what you're saying. It's going deeper and trying to find more understanding and meaning behind it.
Yeah. I mean, you can hear, or I feel like you can hear where composers have ripped off temp music sometimes in films. I'm never 100% sure, but you feel like you can. I'm going to say, you've got to find your place to fight. Like you've got to you capitulate on some things, but then you can fight for certain things, and you just got to fight for the right things to make it interesting. But if the music that you've written is not working for the film, there's no use holding on to that. You've got to be ruthless and
Right.
throw it away, start again. But you can still push for something more interesting. You just got to find the places where you can push and then the places you have to let go.
And you mentioned having worked with Simon previously, I'm sure that helped with pushing the sound and, as you called it, starting in a radical place. But have you
Yeah.
had instances where either you didn't have that sort of relationship or the push wasn't as, I don't want to say resistanceless, but it led to some less than ideal results?
Yeah, you mean where there wasn't enough sort of creative to and fro, and therefore the result was something a bit bland? Because that certainly happens, I think, sometimes. Sometimes, if you're left entirely to your own devices, you come up with something great, actually. I feel like that has happened to me on a couple of theatre productions where I've had a lot of freedom and I've done something great. But sometimes I'm left to my own devices and it doesn't come out quite right. It's like it's really important to have that to and fro with your director to help push you into doing the right thing for the production. Because that's what it comes down to. I mean, whether the music is beautiful in its own right, outside of that, whatever, but you try to make it beautiful, generally speaking, whatever you're doing. But yeah, the important thing is does it work for the project? And it is useful to have a bit of to and fro and to push and to not fight, but just struggle over the ideas and push for what you think is important, and they can push for what they think is important. And I think that's how you end up with something good. And if there isn't enough of that, then you do risk coming up with something a bit ordinary, I think, or just coming up with the wrong thing, or coming up with something which is great musically, which is then shines musically, but then it doesn't serve the production. I think I've done that, unfortunately, maybe on a show or two before, where you do something which people think, oh, the music is great, but then you look back on it and you go, but maybe I shouldn't have done that because it didn't serve the show quite as well as if I'd done something a bit more boring.
I think that you raised two things in there. Well, you've raised many more than that, but two that
Yeah,
immediately come to mind is
yeah,
one, like, of course the main goal is that you're there to amplify the film or the production, but also sometimes too, even if that the score succeeds in that, it can be jarring if the score is significantly better than what the end production is as well. Not to say that the better alternative is, if you're working on something that isn't going to be good, to make your score worse. But it's just
yeah,
an interesting result that happens sometimes where you watch a film that there's been $50 million spent in making it, but the thing that you come away with is, oh well, I didn't like this, that, and that, but the music was good. I don't know. It's an interesting outcome.
yeah. It's interesting. It makes me think a little bit about Johnny Greenwood's writing for film, and Johnny Greenwood is someone I admire a lot as a composer and has inspired me a lot, particularly his score for Norwegian Wood, I think, was one of his earliest scores, which I just found incredibly unexpected and brilliant. Like it served the film so well, and the writing in it is really unusual. But it's interesting because sometimes I think in his scoring, maybe more recently, or in the last 5 years or so, he pushes the boundaries, I think, of what works. Like sometimes I think it jumps out too much for me. And at the same time, I appreciate that he's doing that, and that P.T. Anderson is also taking that risk in doing it that way, because they are stretching what's acceptable and not just falling into the ordinary mold of what's there. So I'm sort of in two minds about that stuff sometimes. It's like, oh, is that going a bit far with it? But at the same time, oh, thank God that you're not just doing the usual thing, and that you're pushing the boundaries of that.
That's a really interesting point, because I think it's something that people quite forget, that in the grand scheme of the arts, film is still in a relatively nascent stage. There's so much
Yeah,
about creating film and scoring for film that not necessarily that we don't understand, but that just hasn't been tried or hasn't been discovered. And so without people pushing that to figure out what new things do work or may work, or what new things may not work, it would lead to a sense of stagnancy in a medium that hasn't been fully discovered. So I love so much seeing experimentation, even if it fails, because at least it's trying something new and trying to push those boundaries. So it's just such an important step for the medium itself.
Yeah, it's really important. And I've certainly watched all of Johnny Greenwood's scores, so no, there's no problem there. I mean, we are at a nascent stage. I know what you mean, but at the same time, we are at a well-established stage in film. Like it's a golden era of film still, I think. We've been doing it for many decades now. And you think about the history of opera, starting at Monteverdi or something, and Baroque opera only went for a couple of hundred years and it became classical opera, and then became 19th century opera. And they're really very different forms in many ways, the way that they work musically and had through composition come in the 19th century, which then, of course, influenced a lot of early film scores. So there is a natural lineage there. But how long's film been around for? 100 years or so now? That's actually a good amount of time to have a sort of established a really good body of work and a medium. So, I mean, I'm sure we've got a few more 100 years to go before it becomes what opera is now, which is sort of an outdated medium, but yeah, it's a rich time for film, I think.
Yeah. All right. So I'll take it back. Saying it was in the nascent stage was too much.
Maybe, yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. There's still much more to come. I mean, you could say that Baroque opera, after it had been going for a couple of 100 years, was still nascent. Like opera didn't really find its true thing for 100 years or 200 years after that.
It's just so funny because at the same time, just like you said, film has been around for 100 years. Almost literally everyone that's been alive, their entire life has been surrounded by film.
Yeah.
And yet to think that, it's still in the early stages, or it's just maturing. We have no idea how much longer it's going to go, and where the medium could be in a decade or 50 years it's really exciting. I think it's also a little bewildering, but I can't wait to see where it goes.
Yeah. I mean, the trend for TV series now is really interesting. These sort of longer form works, because in a way, like a film is a novella. It's, if you want to turn a proper novel into a film, you've got to use a longer format. That's really interesting as well. That the episodic nature of the TV series. And
yeah, absolutely. And that's a whole nother discussion. Even just scoring for TV, it's not something that I'm as familiar with, but it carries with it so many other opportunities and pitfalls that I find particularly fascinating. If you can have a series that lasts for 5-6 seasons, and to hear a cue come up in season 2 and then again in season 4, it's just a level of filmmaking and music that, like you said, is not available in theater, in plays, in opera, or in film.
Yeah, you can maybe do it in really long form theater. There's sort of the 8-hour works. You can do that sort of planting an idea in the first 10 minutes and coming back with it 7 hours later. But that's a rare opportunity to work on a 7-hour work.
Well, I was going to say, I prior to this, I didn't know that there were 7-hour plays. So that is.
You didn't know anyone would sit in the theater for that long. Yeah. Well, there you go.
But you know what? I say that I'm fine listening to the 3-hour Philip Glass operas. So what's another few hours?
Yeah, Einstein on the Beach. How long does that go for? 5 hours or something?
I think it's something.
It's quite long. Yeah, some great music in there. Oh, he's great.
He
Nixon in China is fantastic as well.
Yeah, we can wrap this up.
Well, right, you got some material.
I've got plenty to work with.
Okay, I hope I didn't crap on too much.
No, it was great.
Great.
So I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks. Nice to meet you.